May 1945. The war in Europe was over, but for thousands of German prisoners, the silence that followed felt heavier than gunfire. Inside a makeshift American POW camp near Reims, France, a cold wind swept through rows of canvas tents. The women, former auxiliaries, nurses, and clerks, stood in line, their uniforms stripped of insignia, their faces pale with exhaustion and defeat. The smell of smoke and damp earth hung in the air. From the camp kitchen came another smell, strange, foreign, almost sweet. Some of the women exchanged uneasy glances. The Americans were baking something, flat bread with red sauce and melted cheese. To them, it looked burnt, oily, almost inedible. A young American private, sleeves rolled to his elbows, carried a tray toward the line. He smiled awkwardly, offering a slice to one of the prisoners. She hesitated, staring at the bubbling surface. Around her, others whispered in German, disgust, suspicion, pride. Then hunger won. She took a bite. The crust cracked softly. The sauce touched her tongue, and, for the first time since surrender, she felt something human again. Spring, 1945. Europe stood on the edge of exhaustion. The once unbreakable Reich was fracturing under the weight of Allied firepower. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble and ash. Bridges lay twisted across rivers, and columns of refugees clogged every road leading west. The Third Reich, built on pride, fear, and delusion, was collapsing in real time. As American armored divisions thundered through the Rhineland, their progress revealed the shattered remnants of the German war machine. Entire Wehrmacht units surrendered without a shot. Alongside them came thousands of women, communication auxiliaries, clerks, medics, Luftwaffe support staff, many still wearing the remnants of field-gray uniforms, some in tattered civilian coats. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but they had served the war effort, operating radios, decoding messages, or working in military hospitals. As the front dissolved, these women found themselves swept into the tide of defeat. For many, capture by the Americans meant survival. They had heard stories, terrifying ones, of what awaited prisoners on the Eastern Front. The Red Army's vengeance was merciless. So, when U.S. patrols appeared, many raised white cloths, trembling not with resistance, but with relief. American forces were equally uncertain. Capturing women, trained, uniformed, but not combatants, was an unfamiliar scenario. The Geneva Conventions outlined the treatment of POWs, but few manuals addressed how to handle female prisoners of a defeated enemy. So, the Americans improvised. They separated the women from the men, assigning them to temporary holding camps near France, Belgium, and the western zones of Germany. These camps were functional rather than punitive. Fenced perimeters, wooden barracks or tents, guarded but not brutal. For the American GIs, most of whom had spent years fighting through Europe, these women represented a strange contradiction. The human face of the enemy they had been told to hate. At night, the camps were silent except for the wind moving through barbed wire. Inside the tents, German women whispered of home, of cities bombed beyond recognition, of brothers missing on the Eastern Front, of parents who might never know they were alive. The war was technically over, yet its shadow loomed everywhere. Hunger stalked even the victors. The Americans rationed supplies, but they had enough to share. Canned meat, bread, and something new to German eyes: ketchup, chewing gum, chocolate bars. These simple rations became symbols of a new world. For women who had lived under scarcity and propaganda, every meal was a reminder that their country's promises had crumbled. The chaos on the Western Front gave way to a fragile peace, one measured not in speeches or treaties, but in acts of mercy. Amid the ruins of Europe, a different kind of war began: the struggle to rebuild humanity itself. The women didn't know it yet, but the next battle wouldn't be fought with rifles or ideology. It would begin in the small, unfamiliar comfort of an American meal. By late May 1945, the thunder of artillery had faded, replaced by the quiet order of occupation. Across Western Europe, Allied command faced an unprecedented challenge: managing millions of surrendered German personnel, soldiers, officers, and for the first time on such a scale, women. The Americans established Rhine-Wiesenlager, the Rhine Meadow camps, to process prisoners quickly. Yet, the female auxiliaries were often sent elsewhere. Smaller compounds, sometimes shared with civilians displaced by the war. Though guarded, these camps bore little resemblance to the brutal prisons of the East. The U.S. Army, bound by Geneva Convention standards, sought to maintain dignity, discipline, and at least minimal comfort. Inside the camps, daily life settled into monotony. The women were assigned tasks: cleaning, sewing, nursing the wounded, or cooking. But it was the food that first revealed how different this captivity would be. Gone were the thin broths and rationed bread of wartime Germany. The Americans introduced their own staples: canned corned beef, powdered eggs, instant coffee, and white bread so soft it seemed unreal. To German eyes, it was alien. To German stomachs, miraculous. Yet acceptance did not come easily. Years of propaganda had painted the Americans as crude, materialistic, and gluttonous. Enemies without refinement or soul. Even as hunger gnawed, pride and prejudice lingered. Then came the smaller details, gestures that slowly rewrote perception. Cigarettes offered not as bribes but as conversation starters. Chocolates handed to mothers with small children. Blankets shared during cold nights. GIs taught some prisoners English phrases, while the women taught them bits of German. In time, laughter began to replace suspicion. But it was around the kitchen tents where the most profound exchanges occurred. American field cooks, improvising with surplus rations, prepared meals unlike anything the Germans had ever seen. They mixed tomato sauce from cans, added bits of sausage or cheese, sometimes baking the result over makeshift stoves. To them, it was comfort food, a taste of home for men who had crossed an ocean. To the prisoners, it looked wrong, greasy, red, foreign. Yet curiosity lingered. What kind of enemy shared his food? The Americans' approach contrasted sharply with reports filtering from the East. There, Soviet camps were places of starvation and vengeance. In the West, even amid victory, restraint prevailed. The U.S. command believed that humane treatment could help stabilize post-war Europe, a belief rooted as much in pragmatism as in conscience. And so, behind barbed wire and ration crates, a quiet cultural exchange began. For German women who had been taught that Americans were beasts, the reality was disarming. They were young, kind, and often just as homesick. The meals became more than nourishment. They became messages, unspoken lessons that defeat did not have to mean humiliation. Each bite of American food carried something intangible: the flavor of a world built not on hatred, but on abundance. It was in this fragile environment of uneasy peace and quiet humanity that an unexpected moment unfolded. One that would forever change how these women saw their former enemies. The human side of surrender was seldom recorded in official reports. Behind every statistic and headcount was a story of humiliation, uncertainty, and the slow unraveling of belief. For the German women now living behind Allied wire, the fall of the Reich was not merely a political collapse, it was a collapse of identity. Many had grown up under a system that promised order and destiny. Their training as auxiliaries or nurses had filled them with purpose, serving the fatherland, aiding soldiers, defending what they believed was civilization. But in the spring of 1945, those certainties disintegrated overnight. The flags were gone. The voices that once commanded loyalty were silent or dead. What remained was fear. In the first weeks of captivity, many refused to speak. Some hid their faces. Others clutched at the remnants of uniforms, as though the fabric itself might preserve dignity. They feared retribution, exposure, or worse, recognition of guilt. Rumors spread through the camps that Allied interrogators would punish even secretarial roles, that cooperation meant betrayal, that their names might be recorded for later judgment. And yet, the Americans were strangely calm. Orders from U.S. command stressed discipline and respect. The war was over. Vengeance was not the mission. Instead, camp officers faced an unfamiliar administrative challenge: how to handle women who were technically soldiers, but socially vulnerable. In the tactical sense, this required precision. Each female POW was registered, photographed, and assigned a work detail. Separate quarters were built, guarded but isolated from male camps. Medical staff, sometimes even American nurses, were assigned to monitor conditions. The intent was not luxury, but order. This organization reflected a broader American philosophy: control through structure. The same logistical mastery that had carried the U.S. Army across Europe now extended to human management. Every task, from meal distribution to sanitation, was documented. Even the smallest camps functioned with military efficiency. Rows of tents, designated areas for cooking, washing, and roll call. The guards themselves often rotated in and out, young men barely older than the women they watched. Some had fought in Normandy or the Ardennes. Others had arrived too late for combat. They treated their prisoners with an awkward mixture of authority and compassion. To them, these weren't the faceless enemies from propaganda posters. They were people, thin, tired, and frightened. There were misunderstandings, moments of tension, even minor confrontations. But beneath it all was a quiet discipline. Both sides observed boundaries that, remarkably, held firm. The Americans' insistence on procedure prevented chaos. The Germans' instinct for obedience maintained order. Still, within this structure lay a deeper conflict, the psychological one. The women were torn between pride and dependence, between memory and survival. They had lost everything: their homes, their army, their nation. The only thing left to hold on to was the idea of dignity, and even that felt fragile. Each morning's roll call was a reminder of defeat. Each meal handed through a mess line was an act of surrender repeated daily. But within that routine, something unexpected began to grow. A faint sense of safety. They were still prisoners, but they were alive. And sometimes, in the flicker of a campfire or the passing smile of a guard, they caught glimpses of something unfamiliar. Kindness without motive. It unsettled them at first. Then, slowly, it began to change them. That transformation, the shift from fear to reluctant trust, would soon find its most symbolic expression not in words or orders, but in something far simpler. Culture can survive even in captivity. Within the barbed wire and dust of those American-run camps, an unspoken exchange began, one that carried more meaning than interrogation reports or propaganda leaflets ever could. It started, as so many human stories do, with food. To the American guards, food was routine. They prepared their meals with military precision: mess lines, portion counts, tin plates stacked on folding tables. To the German prisoners, however, each dish carried a shock of unfamiliarity. They had lived through years of rationing, subsisting on black bread, turnip soup, and meager scraps of meat. Now, they watched Americans pour thick sauces, fry bacon, and sprinkle strange seasonings over flour and cheese. At first, the women turned away. The smells were too strong, the textures too foreign. When tomato sauce touched their plates for the first time, many thought it was spoiled. Butter seemed excessive, sugar almost sinful. Yet hunger is a universal translator. After the initial hesitation, curiosity took hold. The Americans, noticing the women's reluctance, began to explain through gestures and broken words. They mimed, "Eat, good, try." They pointed at themselves, smiling. Some of the German women, shy but intrigued, mimicked them. Laughter followed, the first genuine laughter since the surrender. In those moments, civility replaced division. A simple act of sharing food became the first bridge across the chasm of war. For both sides, it was disarming. The guards realized that these were not monsters or ideologues. They were young women who missed home, who worried about family, who were scared. The prisoners, in turn, saw that the Americans were not the soulless invaders their leaders had described, but ordinary men with manners, humor, and even empathy. Within weeks, the camp kitchens became small islands of coexistence. German women were sometimes assigned to help cook or clean, learning American methods as they worked. They watched how the soldiers mixed tomato paste with spices, how they kneaded dough, how they experimented with flavors far beyond wartime scarcity. One dish in particular became a quiet legend among the camps. A flat, bread-like meal the Americans improvised using flour, canned tomato, and bits of cheese or sausage. It wasn't truly pizza, not yet, but it carried the spirit of it. To the Germans, it was odd, too oily, and certainly un-German. Yet, once they tried it, something changed. The sharpness of the tomato, the warmth of the crust, the unexpected sweetness. It was unlike anything they'd known. Food turned into language. A slice offered was no longer just sustenance. It was an unspoken apology, an act of grace. For the Americans, feeding their former enemies reaffirmed what victory was supposed to mean. Not domination, but restoration of humanity. For the Germans, accepting that food was the first step toward understanding the world beyond their propaganda-shaped horizon, the moral shift was profound. Within the boundaries of wire and command, the idea of enemy began to dissolve. Some women later wrote in diaries that they felt more respected by their captors than by their own superiors. The war had taken their homes, but captivity gave them a strange kind of awakening. They began to see the Americans as what they truly were, young men barely older than themselves, carrying not hatred but the heavy weariness of battle. And as the days stretched into weeks, something silent and enduring formed between them. The knowledge that decency could survive even when nations could not. That fragile humanity would be tested soon. In one small, seemingly trivial moment around a camp kitchen, when something as simple as a single bite of food would turn fear into understanding. The morning began like any other inside the camp. Gray skies, damp air, the sound of boots crunching over gravel. The women lined up for rations, metal cups in hand, eyes fixed on the ground. A guard's whistle echoed through the compound, followed by the low rumble of conversation near the mess tent. But that day, something was different. The smell drifting from the kitchen wasn't the usual blend of boiled beans and corned beef. It was sharper, richer, something roasted and faintly sweet. Inside the canvas kitchen, a young American cook named Private Ellis had decided to experiment. He'd grown up in New York, the son of Italian immigrants, and had been joking for weeks that Army food could use a little home style. With leftover flour, tomato paste from ration tins, and a few slices of processed cheese, he'd made something that reminded him of home, his mother's pizza. The other soldiers teased him as he worked. "You think the Krauts are going to eat that?" one asked. Ellis only shrugged. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe not. But it smells better than powdered eggs." Word spread quickly through the camp. The Americans were cooking something strange. A few of the German women peeked from their tents, whispering. They could see the cook bending over a makeshift oven, just a steel drum with coals beneath a grill plate. A thin crust browned over the heat, bubbling under streaks of red sauce. When the meal call came, the women stepped forward hesitantly. A few guards handed out the usual bread and coffee, but on one table sat a tray of the new dish, flat pieces of baked dough topped with melted cheese. To the prisoners, it looked burnt, greasy, and crude. Some wrinkled their noses. One muttered under her breath, "Americanisches chaos," Private Ellis noticed. He wasn't offended. Instead, he picked up a slice, took a bite in front of them, and nodded approvingly. "Good," he said simply, tapping his chest. "Good." The prisoners watched in silence. A few glanced toward their supervisors, uncertain if they were even allowed to take it. The camp sergeant, seeing the hesitation, gestured for them to try. "It's food," he said plainly. "Eat." Still, they lingered. Hunger fought against pride. One of the women, Anna, a 24-year-old radio operator from Hamburg, stepped forward. She had been captured near Cologne weeks earlier, her hands still rough from dismantling field transmitters. She stared at the tray, then reached for a piece. The crust was warm, the cheese congealing under the morning chill. She lifted it slowly, sniffed, and frowned. "It smells wrong," she whispered in German. The woman beside her nodded, but the growl in her stomach argued louder. Her first bite was tentative. A test. The texture surprised her. The crust cracked, then softened. The sauce carried a sharp tang. The cheese a hint of salt and smoke. She paused. It wasn't terrible. It was strange, but not bad. Behind her, Ellis smiled. "Good?" he asked, raising his eyebrows. Anna hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. The soldiers laughed, not mockingly, but with relief. It broke the tension like sunlight through fog. Soon, others followed her lead, picking up slices, tasting, chewing slowly. The scene was quiet at first, awkward and unsure. But gradually, a ripple of conversation spread. Short words in broken English and hesitant German, gestures of approval, shy smiles. Even those who had refused to touch the food began to edge closer, curiosity overtaking resistance. For a moment, the barbed wire, the uniforms, and the memories of war seemed to fade. In their place stood something simpler, a shared moment of ordinary humanity. It was not victory, it was not forgiveness, but it was the beginning of understanding. As the day unfolded, word of the strange American food spread beyond the mess tent. The scent carried across the camp. Tomato, smoke, bread, and something almost festive, drifting through the rows of canvas shelters. Guards laughed quietly as they watched the German women react with suspicion, curiosity, and finally, faint amusement. Anna and a few others returned for second helpings, no longer hiding their interest. One of them, a nurse from Munich named Greta, joked in halting English, "Too much sauce," but "Good." The Americans chuckled. For the first time since the surrender, laughter passed naturally between the two sides. Brief, fragile, but real. Later that afternoon, Ellis wrote in his small field notebook, "Gave them pizza today. They thought it was poison. Then they smiled." The note was simple, almost careless, but it marked something profound. These were not political gestures, not orders from command, just spontaneous humanity born in a place built for control and captivity. In later accounts collected from post-war interviews and Red Cross inspection reports, similar stories emerged. German POWs, male and female alike, frequently spoke about their astonishment at how the Americans treated them. They mentioned being fed well, allowed rest, even offered books and games. For many, these moments redefined what enemy meant. One female prisoner, identified only as EL, in a 1947 Red Cross document, wrote, "They gave us food I had never seen before. It looked strange. I thought it must be a trick, but it was good. We realized they were not like the Russians. They wanted peace." That realization was echoed by others. Small acts, a cigarette shared, a guard handing over a chocolate bar, a young GI showing a photograph of his family, began to dissolve the rigid walls of propaganda that had been built over 12 brutal years. For the Americans, the moment carried its own lessons. Many guards had seen the aftermath of concentration camps only weeks earlier. they had witnessed horror on an unimaginable scale. To then serve food, to extend kindness to Germans, especially women who had once worn the enemy's uniform, felt complicated. Some wrestled with guilt, others with confusion. But the discipline of decency held firm. Camp commanders like Colonel Robert E. Hogan, who oversaw POW operations near Le Mans, later wrote, "If we behaved as they did to us, we'd lose everything we fought for." That belief, that morality and victory defined civilization, guided American policy and behavior throughout the Western occupation zones. And so, within the wire, two worlds quietly met. The Germans learned that the Americans were neither barbaric nor vengeful. The Americans discovered that their former enemies were capable of gratitude and humility. Anna, the radio operator, would later recount her memory to an interviewer in 1953. Her words were soft, reflective. "They offered us something strange. This bread with red sauce. We thought it was a joke. But when I tasted it, I laughed. I realized then that everything we had been told was wrong. The Americans did not hate us. They pitied us. That moment, a single bite of unfamiliar food, carried the weight of a generation's awakening." For her, and for many like her, it became a symbol of how the world could change not through speeches or treaties, but through compassion expressed in the simplest form imaginable. The pizza that day wasn't just a meal, it was an introduction to a new world, to a new way of thinking, to the possibility that forgiveness could exist even among ruins. And in that silent, smoky camp, the first seeds of post-war reconciliation were planted. Not in the halls of governments, but in the warmth of a soldier's improvised oven. When the war ended and the camps began to empty, the tone among the German women had changed in ways few had anticipated. The first months of captivity had been marked by fear, of retribution, starvation, or humiliation. Yet, by the time the repatriation process began in late 1946 and 1947, many of those same women described their time in American custody as unexpectedly humane, even transformative. Letters collected by the International Committee of the Red Cross and post-war debriefings tell a quiet but consistent story. Former prisoners, now back in ruined German towns, wrote about the fairness of their treatment and the strange kindness of their captors. "They could have taken revenge," one woman wrote from Bremen, "but they did not. They taught us what dignity meant." Such testimonies carried weight in a country still suffocating under the shame of defeat and the moral wreckage of the Nazi years. To admit that the enemy had behaved honorably was, for many, the first step toward confronting the lies of their own government. For female prisoners especially, many of whom had served in auxiliary or medical roles rather than combat, the experience of being treated as human beings rather than monsters helped soften their defensiveness and opened the path toward introspection. Several accounts describe moments of startling tenderness. In one instance, a German translator named Hilda recalled that an American nurse secretly gave her lipstick before repatriation, saying, "Go home beautiful, start new." For Hilda, it symbolized the possibility of reclaiming femininity, pride, and self-respect after years of war and propaganda. Back in Germany, these women carried their impressions into a society that was trying to rebuild not only physically, but morally. Some worked with aid organizations that distributed American relief supplies, citing their own experiences in U.S. custody as proof that cooperation was possible. Others married Allied soldiers, an unthinkable act only months before. In interviews decades later, many credited those early interactions with shaping their attitudes toward democracy and Western values. Historians studying German POW narratives often point to the disproportionate number of former prisoners who became advocates of reconciliation. Their writings and interviews rarely glorified the Americans, but they acknowledged something that mattered more: respect. One woman summarized it simply: "They conquered us, but they did not humiliate us." By the time these stories reached a new generation, they had evolved into something almost symbolic. Reminders that mercy can be as powerful as victory, and that humanity, even in uniform, could survive the darkest war in history. For the Americans who served as guards, officers, and nurses in the post-war camps, the experience left its own mark. Subtler, perhaps, but just as lasting. At first, most of them viewed their German captives through the lens of propaganda and rage. These were the enemy, the people who had plunged the world into war, who had supported Hitler's regime. Yet, when the prisoners arrived, weary, history often remembers wars by their battles, by the thunder of artillery, the clash of tanks, the numbers of dead. But sometimes, peace begins with something as small as a shared meal. In that quiet camp kitchen in 1945, the war between two worlds briefly ended. Not through treaties or speeches, but through taste. A simple dish, born of American homes and Italian heritage, crossed a cultural divide no weapon ever could. For those German women, that slice of pizza was more than food. It was a moment of rediscovered humanity. It reminded them that the enemy could also laugh, cook, and care, that behind the uniform was a person. For the Americans, offering that meal was its own victory. The victory of restraint, of compassion, after unimaginable destruction. Decades later, historians would note that such small encounters shaped how Europe rebuilt, not just through politics or economics, but through empathy. The post-war generation that followed grew up eating together, trading recipes, marrying across borders, and turning former battlefields into shared markets and memories. The war had taught the world how to destroy, but in that fleeting act of kindness, a meal shared between former enemies, it learned again how to heal. Because sometimes the truest peace doesn't come from power. It comes from understanding. One bite at a time,